Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online Bible study. I'm Matthew, the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church, where every Tuesday night we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, a text to study. You remember that last week we did something slightly different as we reflected on the Holocaust. And prior to that, we've been doing a series of teaching on the books of the New Testament called The New Creation Story. And we're looking at the Gospels, we're looking at the book of Acts, and we've also been looking at Paul's letters and how they apply to the Christian life. And so far, as we've looked at Paul's letters, we've been doing them mainly in chronological order rather than in the order that we get them in the New Testament. We looked at Galatians, Thessalonians, and then Romans, and then Paul's letters to the Church of Corinth. And then we looked at his prison epistles, his prison letters, Philemon, Colossians, Ephesians, and Philippines. And so we've been looking at a number of his letters. And what we're going to be doing tonight is that we're going to be starting to look at some letters, his last three letters particularly, that he wrote after his first imprisonment and before his second imprisonment. So you will know that in the book of Acts, really tells the story of Paul's missionary journeys right up until his first imprisonment. He goes to Rome to face the emperor at that time. And personally, I believe that Luke wrote the book of Acts as a defense for Paul's mission and message before seeing Caesar. And I think it was written as a defense to give to Paul's defense attorney. And so we know that up until about the year 60 to 62 AD, Paul experienced his first imprisonment. And it was during his first imprisonment that he wrote those letters that I mentioned before: Philemon, Colossians, Philippines, Colossians, Philippines, and Ephesians, I should say, okay? And he wrote those letters. So we know that Paul, after that point, that would seem that Luke made a good case for Paul's defense, and it would seem that Paul was released from prison. He faced trial before Caesar. He was released from Caesar's court, and for at least 2 to 3 years, he had time to minister, maybe plant some more churches. We know that he wanted to go to Spain and do some work in Spain, but it would seem that he had a bit of freedom to plant some more churches. And it was during this time that he wrote two of his letters, which is 1 Timothy and Titus, prior to his second arrest or second imprisonment, somewhere around between 64 and 67 AD, where he wrote his final letter, 2 Timothy, prior to being while he was in prison and prior to his execution, most likely under Caesar Nero. And so it was during that window of freedom between those years, between 62 and 64 AD, that Paul wrote these next two letters, 1 Timothy and Titus. And so tonight what we're going to be looking at is the pastoral letters, 1 Timothy and Titus, listening to the right people. And then next week, we're going to look at Paul's last letter, which is 2 Timothy. Now, we all need godly leaders. We all need mentors in life, people who can speak into our lives, bring words of instruction, advice, and direction, to help us make wise choices and decisions. And I know that particularly for myself in my younger years, in my 20s, I wanted to have godly men speak into my life who can just help mentor me and direct me and help me to make some wise decisions in different aspects of life. And, when we read the letters like 1 Timothy and Titus, and also 2 Timothy as well, we pick up this sense of Paul being a mentor to Timothy and to Titus. And it just highlights the value of that, how much we need that each in our own lives. And so when Paul wrote these letters, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, we read that these were very much personal letters. Now, we know that when he wrote to Philemon, which we looked at earlier on, that he was writing a personal letter to Philemon regarding to one of his runaway slaves, a man by the name of Onesimus. But we also know that when he wrote Philemon, he was writing it also to address the church that met in his home as well. But when we come to his letters to Timothy and Titus, these are specifically to individuals. Although they have an impact upon the church, they deal mainly with issues with these men and their role in leadership within the church setting. And so it is for this reason that these letters are sometimes referred to as the pastoral epistles or letters. And that was a phrase that took root back in the 1700s with theologians like N.D.M. Burdett and Paul Anton, because they capture the essence of these letters, that they address issues related to pastoral leadership, church order, and also spiritual maturity. And so, as I mentioned earlier on, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to focus specifically on Paul's letters to 1 Timothy and Titus, because they address pretty similar issues, okay? And then 2 Timothy will lead to later on, because they're addressing issues that you don't find elsewhere in the rest of Paul's letters. So they address issues to do with pastoral leadership, the qualifications for leaders, how worship should be conducted in the church setting, although there is a little bit of that in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And it's because of this that some scholars don't believe that 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and I would imagine Titus, they'll put in that category as well, were not written by Paul, because they claim that Paul was more concerned about the second coming of the Lord than he was necessarily about church leadership issues. Now, my response, and therefore they would reject that Paul maybe even wrote these letters. Now, my response to that is complete and utter nonsense. That view held by some scholars is mainly speculative, and in my opinion raises more questions than it actually answers, because we know from the book of Acts that Paul planted churches. In those churches, he appointed leaders, and therefore it's entirely reasonable and even to be expected that Paul would give instructions about what are the qualities of pastors, of local churches, of elders. And so in these letters, we get such a description. And everything in these letters points that they are written by exactly the person they claim to be written, and that is the Apostle Paul. So any attempts to deny this, in my view, don't feel like careful scholarship, but more like a desire to undermine the reliability of Scripture. Or it's probably because some liberal theologians don't like some of the things that are written in 1 Timothy, and therefore they try to remove Paul from being the author of that letter, to remove any legitimacy from it. And that's my view on that, okay? But it's very clear that First and 2 Timothy and Titus are written by whom they are claimed to be written, by the Apostle Paul. So with that in mind, let's delve into these letters, specifically tonight, looking at 1 Timothy and Titus, and then next week we'll look at 2 Timothy. So the first question we really need to ask is, how did Paul become connected with Timothy and Titus? Well, both Timothy and Titus were part of Paul's apostolic team. So Paul never did ministry on his own. Wherever he would go with a team of people. Luke was on that team, as well as Titus. And Timothy was a guy called Zenas, Apollos, a few others as well. They were part of Paul's team. And what would often happen when Paul would plant a church, sometimes he would need to move on. Oftentimes what Paul would do is that he would leave a member of his apostolic team in that church to maybe bring some supplementary teaching or to finish off what Paul didn't have time to finish, or appoint leaders, and then they would come back to Paul and support him. They would often act as his representatives. Sometimes Paul would send members of his team to a church to troubleshoot an issue that needed to be addressed. And so there were at least two members of his team that were very helpful in this, Timothy and Paul. Timothy and Titus, Paul met Timothy while he was in the town of Lystra. And when he met him, he notes that that his mother was a believer, as was his grandmother a believer, and they had a profound influence upon his life. His father was a Greek, and Paul saw that actually Timothy was someone who would be incredible, of great value to him and his ministry. And so on many occasions when Paul was going about his ministry, if Paul, under the circumstances, was pressured to leave a particular place, Timothy would often stay behind as Paul's representative to finish off what Paul couldn't finish. And so Timothy was a great help and an asset to Paul. One particular incident when Paul would send Timothy to a church, or to various churches, particularly to churches like Corinth, where he would act as his representative, okay? And so to Paul, Timothy was like a son, okay? He was someone who he just took under his arms, he mentored him, he nurtured him, just to see him grow in his faith. As well as Timothy, there's also another man by the name of Titus. And Titus was part of Paul's apostolic team. He was especially a robust character. I often described Titus as Paul's bulldog. He would do the difficult tasks, and we see this particularly with the Church of Corinth. We know that on one occasion when Paul sent Timothy to Corinth to deal with some issues, and it would seem that Timothy was not up to the task of dealing with it. And so Paul sent Titus to Corinth instead, and Titus was a much more direct and confrontational character and was able to deal with the issues in a way that Timothy was not. And so Titus was able to deal with situations that were particularly difficult and sensitive. So at the time when Paul wrote these two letters, 1 Timothy and Titus, Timothy was at that time staying in the city of Ephesus, and Titus was on the island of Crete. And so it's during this time between Paul's first and second imprisonment that Paul wrote these letters. And so this is not recorded in the book of Acts. This was a time after the book of Acts. So if you look at Paul's letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy, it's clear that while Timothy was in Ephesus, there were a number of controversies and issues that were being raised up that needed to be addressed, particularly issues of false teaching, which we're going to look at in a moment. And so Paul writes to Timothy informing him that he needs to address and to confront these issues, but he also wants to encourage Timothy to persevere in his faith, to stir up the gift that is within him. And he's just being a real father figure, a spiritual mentor to Timothy in that situation. One thing you'll notice about Timothy as well as a person is that he has a tendency towards lacking confidence. Because he's the youngest on his team, and he doesn't feel and he has a timid nature, he lacks confidence. And so Paul writes this letter to bring encouragement and confidence to Timothy, to make him feel, to help him realize that actually I have full confidence in you, Timothy, that you can do the task that I am directing you and commissioning you to do. And so Paul writes not only to instruct Timothy regarding the issues within the church, but also to strengthen his confidence and to strengthen that sense of calling that Timothy has. So if we give you a bit of a background to Paul's letter to Timothy, his first letter, it goes as follows. Firstly, we have a greeting. Then we have some instructions concerning the church, false teachers and sound doctrine, public worship, leadership qualifications, and the foundation of all truth, which is the church. And then we also see some personal instructions for Timothy. We had an exemplary life as a best defense against the false teaching, guidance on relationships within church with elders, widows, and slaves, warnings about wealth and the need for proper pastoral priorities, and there's also a final charge. And so in this letter, I would say there are 7 things really just to pick up from that I would say that Paul emphasizes. The first issue is the issue of false teaching, as was often the case when Paul go about his ministry, there were plenty of false teachers who would seek to undermine Paul's teaching, Judaizers being one of them, but it was also a growing influence of Gnosticism, okay? So Gnosticism was the belief that actually the ultimate goal in life is to achieve a special kind of knowledge as a means of access to God. And it would seem that Paul was refuting that Gnosticism, which is why which seemed to indicate when he talks about those who falsely call what is knowledge, he seems to allude to that in Paul's words to Timothy in this letter. Another false teaching that was going about was Marcionite teaching, and that was the teaching that somehow the God of the New Testament is different from the God of the Old Testament. And so that could be another false teaching that Paul was trying to avoid. Whatever the root of the false teaching was in Ephesus, clearly there were some specific issues that Paul was addressing with. So issues like abstaining from certain foods and marriage, that's like a false treatment of the body or the good things that God has for us. Promoting godless myths and old wives' tales, distorting the purpose and proper use of the law. All these were things that Paul was telling Timothy, you need to confront these issues and you need to address them. So that's the first thing. He was addressing the issue of false teaching. Secondly, the centrality of Christ is paramount in Paul's letter to Timothy. Paul presents to us a glorious and exalted picture of the work and the person of who Jesus is, especially when we consider that that he was once was and what he has now become, that Christ has come into this world and that he is the mediator between us and God. In fact, one of the most striking statements that Paul brings in this letter is when he says, for there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus. And so Paul uniquely affirms both Jesus' divinity and his humanity, and that his unique role as a mediator between us and God. And so in Jesus Christ, both humanity and divinity meet in one person. And therefore, we have access to God through our faith in Jesus Christ. And so Paul is very clear to warn Timothy that everything that we do in this Christian life flows from this central truth that Christ is not merely important, but he is also central. And so not only do we have warnings against false teachings, the centrality of Christ, but also we see that Paul gives Timothy personal advice. He tells him to give his full attention to his calling and to his ministry. He warns him to be vigilant, not only over his lifestyle and his teaching, but also to those within the church, that he is the guard to protect the church. He is to ensure that everything aligns with sound doctrine. And so for Paul, both our beliefs and our lifestyle go together hand in hand. And that's of crucial importance. He also gives some advice to look after his health as well. He also brings some instructions on worship and the appropriate use of worship. He talks about the role of men and women in conduct in worship. He gives instructions, especially for those in positions of authority, what's appropriate. And so he reflects his conviction that all churches should be marked by peace, by order, and by intercession for the wider world. He also brings the importance of qualifications for leadership. And we see this particularly in Paul's letter to Titus, which we're going to look at in a moment. But Paul speaks clearly about ecclesiological roles within the church and the responsibilities. And there's two key things that Paul highlights, two key words, I should say. One is this word episkopos, which is a word that he uses specifically in Timothy, and it means bishop or overseer. So it's not talking about the Episcopalian church. What he's talking about is the function of those who serve in church leadership. And literally it means to oversee or to act as a supervisor to the church, who oversees the affairs of the church. And so that is a key term that Paul uses. The other word is the word presbyteros, which has more to do with the character of the leader. And this is specifically what Paul uses when he writes to Titus. And that actually, in Paul's mind, the character of the leader is of greater value and importance than actually what the leader actually does. Because actually what the leader does flows out of their integrity and their maturity and their moral credibility. And then finally, the other thing that Paul addresses when he's writing to Timothy is that the importance of identifying real needs. Paul offers some really worthwhile practical wisdom in how to identify those people who have real needs in the church. The widow, the orphan, the slave, the servants. He gives instructions, particularly for the widows and the orphans in the church. He gives instructions on how he is to relate to older men, older women, younger men, and younger women, and that he also highlights the importance that an accusation should not be entertained against one who is in leadership unless it's brought by two or more witnesses, and also the guard against covetousness and the love of money, but to learn to be content with what you have in leadership. Otherwise, our priorities get misplaced in leadership. In fact, people have shipwrecked their faith and their ministry because of misplaced priorities. And so these are some of the really important points that Paul highlights in his letter to Timothy, in his first letter to Timothy. Then we come to Paul's letter also to Titus. And again, I mentioned earlier on that Paul wrote Titus at a similar time that he wrote First Timothy. And you remember that Titus was in the island of Crete at the time when Paul wrote this letter. So Paul is dealing with a different set of issues than he was with Timothy. And although there is no direct evidence, at least from Luke, that Paul planted a church in Crete, we do know from Luke's account that Paul passed Crete on his way to Rome. We also know that there was a Jewish presence in the island of Crete, because there were some Jews from Crete who were present at Jerusalem at the day of Pentecost. So it's likely that when Paul planted a church in Crete, it was between his first and second imprisonment that he went there. And at that time, he appointed Titus to oversee the work that was being involved with in the island of Crete. And so he wrote this letter to instruct Titus to finish off some unfinished tasks that needed to be done. But what is clear is it would seem that there were some Judaizers who had come to the island of Crete who were disrupting the work of Paul, and they were informing some of the churches that they had to go back to resort to the law of Moses for them to be justified before God. And therefore, Paul is writing this letter primarily to instruct Titus to make sure that he is appointing leaders who can refute this false teaching that was creeping into the church. And so when Paul is writing this letter to Titus to instruct this, he also wants to relieve Titus of his responsibilities in Crete, because he needs to come and meet him in a place called Nicopolis. And during that time, he is going to instruct some other members of his team, guys like Artemas, Tychicus, Zenas, and Apollos, to stay behind in Crete and to continue the work that Titus was continuing, and so that Titus can support Paul while he's in Nicopolis. And so Paul's main concern is obviously to refute false teaching in the churches in Crete, but also for the organizational stability of the churches in Crete. He wants to ensure that there's sound doctrine in the churches, that there is godly leadership, that these things are in place, and that there's a healthy structure so that the work of God can continue to flourish in Crete. So if we were to give you an outline of Paul's letter to Titus, it'll go something like this. Paul gives a greeting. He gives instructions on the elders, their qualifications and appointment. He warns against false teachers in Crete. He gives a ministerial charge to Titus, instructions over older men and women, instructions to young men, instructions to slaves, commitment to sound teaching and the avoidance of foolish controversies, and also his travel plans and conclusion. So just to give you a bit of a brief outline of a few key points in Paul's letter to Titus, these will include church leadership. Like his first letter to Timothy, Paul gives instructions on the qualifications of elders, what they should be like. However, there's a specific emphasis that elders should be apt to teach and be able to refute those who contradict sound doctrine. And so he makes a real point to Titus that the elders have to be men of integrity, but are able to refute those who don't adhere to sound doctrine, which goes to this issue of them being able to refute those potential Judaizers. As well as that, Paul makes a very notorious remark regarding the character of the Cretans. He says that they are lazy brutans and lazy brutes and liars. In fact, Paul was quoting one of the Greek philosophers of Crete. And so I don't believe that the Cretans are the same today by any means. But nevertheless, they had a bit of a reputation. And Paul was saying, don't allow that influence to creep into the church. And so he addresses issues of leadership. The second issue is he addresses are to do with social groups. And he gives instructions about the relationships between mentors and mentorees, that older men are to mentor younger men, older women are to mentor younger women, and that they are to live exemplary lives, even in the face of possible opposition for the Roman authorities. In fact, he was saying that actually the example of our lives should serve as something that is winsome to those who don't know Christ, so that they would actually want to know Christ. And that is a really important emphasis that Paul places upon the churches in Crete with Titus. And then finally, Paul also gives a warning of false teachers. I mentioned earlier on the main issue with the churches in Crete was the false teaching of the Judaizers, who are saying that they had to go back to the law of Moses to be justified. And Paul mentions that these men are actually not motivated by a sincere desire to pursue what's true, but actually are motivated for their own selfish ends and their own dishonest gain. And so Paul instructs Titus that these men need to be rebuked and they need to be restrained. And therefore the church needs to protected from this false teaching. And so as we close the session tonight, as we look both at these letters of Paul's letter to Timothy, his first letter to Timothy, and to Titus, they remind us that the Christian life is not only about what we believe, but also about how we live our lives and who we listen to, the people who allow us to speak into our hearts. That in the time of doctrinal confusion and cultural pressure and moral compromise, Paul insists on three essentials. He insists on sound teaching, on godly character, and on Christ-centered leadership. And that's important. Both letters show us that the church does not grow strong by accident. It grows strong when truth is being protected, when leaders model integrity, when believers understand that our everyday conduct either commends the gospel or contradicts the gospel. And we see that particularly in Titus. For Paul, maturity is not measured by influence or gifting or charisma, but by faithfulness, perseverance, and Christ-likeness. And that's what measures maturity in each of our lives. And above all, the key thing that you find in both of these letters is Jesus Christ, that Jesus takes center place in these letters. He is not a peripheral figure. He is the mediator of a new message. He is the model, the example that we follow. He is the one, he is fully divine and fully human in one person. And everything we do flows from him. And so when Christ is central, our doctrine is sound, leaders stay humble, and the church becomes a living witness to the transforming power of the gospel. Well, guys, that's a thought to think about tonight. We've actually covered quite a bit there in 1 Timothy and in Titus. And next week, we're going to look at the last of Paul's letters in 2 Timothy. Just to give us a question to ponder tonight, guys, for our life group study, life group questions. Who has had the greatest spiritual influence on your life? And what qualities made them trustworthy? How can you become that kind of influence for someone else? So who has had the greatest spiritual influence on your life? What qualities made them trustworthy? And how can you become that kind of influence to someone else? And a text study, I'd like you to read 1 Timothy chapters 4 verses 12 to 16. What does Paul tell Timothy to pay attention to in his life in ministry? So what does Paul tell Timothy to pay attention to in his life and ministry? How are Timothy's conduct and teaching connected to the health of the church? And what does this passage suggest about the relationship between personal character and spiritual influence? And how might this passage apply to someone who does not see themselves as a leader? Well, guys, hopefully you got something out of that tonight. Listen, if you enjoyed that teaching tonight, why not give it a thumbs up? Why not share it? Why not subscribe to this channel if you haven't already done so? Hey, listen, God bless you. Have a great rest of the week. Looking forward to seeing you over the weekend. God bless you all.